Well, good afternoon. My name is Ben Morgan. I am the principal at the Center for Crisis and Risk Communications, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode, if you will, of Crisis and Coffee. Hope you had a chance to top up your coffee cup. We all have. My virtual coffee shop background. So amazing to see such great friends and colleagues all come in to have a chat with us. This is a little bit different this week. I want to give you a little bit of a background. So about 5 weeks ago, we started Crisis and Coffee, which was just a opportunity for like-minded people to get together and support each other in the crisis space, ask a question, ask for some support, or just share what's happening. We've been doing that for the past 5 weeks, which has just been amazing. Great camaraderie, great support for all of us. We've had some special guests along the way. If you've joined us in the past, we've had some really great people come on and talk to us about their experiences and what's happening, especially as it relates to COVID-19. And I got to tell you, I was pretty blown away when my mentor, my advisor, my man crush, the godfather of risk and crisis communications, Dr. Covello, reached out and said, "Hey, what's this coffee chat you're doing, and how can we get involved?" So I was over the moon happy and thrilled to have this conversation. And it's funny when you bring in somebody like Dr. Covello and Dr. Hyer, all of a sudden our 16 attendees for Crisis and Coffee goes to 90. So that's fantastic. So we have to do it a little bit differently this week. If you've been Crisis and Coffee in the past, you will see that we do it as a meeting so everybody can see each other and we just have conversation. This week, because of the interest, we did set it up as a webinar. So just to keep the flow going. And we also asked you to submit questions ahead of time. I have to be so respectful of the time of these folks that are out doing some amazing work, which they'll talk about. I'd like to introduce you first to a man I admire and want to one day walk in that guy's footsteps. I had the great fortune of meeting Dr. Covello I think it was about 6 years ago, and have been to a couple of his workshops and brought him up to Calgary to do a couple other workshops and follow his work. I use his teachings and his research in my classes that I teach, and just an inspiration. And I'll tell you what I love most about you, Dr. Covello, is the work that you do is literally helping to save the world. The work that you do is about health and security and safety for people. And that's incredibly admirable to me. So Dr. Covello, he is currently the director of the Center for Risk Communication. He is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in risk and crisis communication. He's been a senior advisor to the World Health Organization. You may have heard of them recently. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, that's the CDC in the US, and so many other organizations. Dr. Covello is the author of more than 150 articles in scientific journals and the author and editor of more than 20 books. I think I'm in one of your chapters in one of your upcoming books. That was a milestone for me. He's a consultant, a writer, a speaker, a teacher, keynote speaker, trainer on evidence-based high concern communication skills. He has been a professor of environmental sciences and clinical medicine at the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health, and he's received his BA with honors and MA from Cambridge University and his doctorate from Columbia University. And fun fact, he's an amazing gardener. And we're so lucky that he has brought with him today an inspirational man that I just met the other day, and I love his energy and humor, which we all need a little bit more humor these days, is Dr. Randall Hyer. Dr. Hyer is the Deputy Director of the Center for Risk Communication. He is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in risk and crisis communications. He has been a medical officer at the World Health Organization and a senior advisor to the National Academy of Sciences. and so many other organizations. He has published widely in the fields of medicine and public health. Dr. Hyer graduated with distinction from the U.S. Naval Academy and received his MD from Duke University, his MPH and the PhD from Oxford University. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Hyer. This just sucks that we're doing this virtual coffee chat. I would love to be in a coffee shop with you guys. I feel like a little schoolgirl. I'm like having little heart flutters. And Dr. Vincent Covello and Dr. Randy Hyer have brought a surprise guest along that we might be able to pick their brains, his brain, Lieutenant Stephan Margolius. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Risk Communication, and he has decades of experience as a practitioner, trainer, program developer in crisis management and decision-making. His work on COVID-19 has been focused on the needs and concerns of special populations, including first responders. Here's a guy that just retired from the Major Crimes Division of the Los Angeles Police Department. We were having a nice chat earlier on about some of the things that he's seen and dealt with, and it's pretty amazing. He has 41 years of law enforcement experience. His policing experiences is including managing field operations in counterterrorism, transnational organized crimes, gangs, narcotics. He's held positions where he's managed major international investigations in domestic complex incidents, and has consulted with national and international agencies, as well as that little house in Washington called the White House. He has received numerous awards for leadership and innovation, and he has been an adjunct professor in behavioral science graduate school at California State University. And in addition to specialized law enforcement training and graduating the FBI National Academy, he holds just 2 graduate degrees, one in philosophy, one in behavioral science and public administration. He also has extensive work with the renowned primatologist, Jane Goodall. So there's a little extra somebody sitting in on the coffee chat today. So inspiring to have you guys all here. Thank you so much. This is going to be a little different than our past crisis and coffee chats. For all of you that have joined us, thank you. I imagine you to be the flies on the wall in the coffee shop and overhearing this conversation that's about to occur. And we have tried our best to address the questions that you've submitted ahead of time. We won't have time to get to all of them. If you do feel so inspired, please feel free to submit a question in the Q&A box as well. And if we can get to those, we will. If not, our team here at the Center for Crisis Risk Communications will try to respond to you as well. These guys just aren't going to have the time to get to every question as much as we wish they could. So with that, a safety moment, please take a look around you and find your nearest exit. This is a great reminder that in your own home, you should have an emergency plan to get out of your house if you need it. And there's Covello. And you may want to just take a moment and reacquaint yourself where the bathrooms are in your home. So without further ado, be quiet, Ben, kick it over. What I'd like to do is ask Dr. Covello and Dr. Hyer and Stephan, if you guys would just maybe do a little intro about yourself. I just did the speechy speech, but we'd just like to see you and get to know you a little bit. And really, what have you seen, or what has been the most impactful piece of this whole COVID-19 or pandemic, your biggest observation or what you've experienced that has caused you to say, huh, or wow? So let me toss it to Dr. Covello.
Mute myself.
You're good to go.
I'm good to go. Okay, good. So first, it's a pleasure being together with my buddies in this coffee room. Is that where we are? It might be a Starbucks. I saw a barista behind you. So welcome aboard. And I also like to thank everyone for giving their time today to join us for coffee. I do have my coffee cup that I bought in Canada. See here. Celebration. So Jeff, Ben, thank you very much for inviting us, and Stephan and Randy. Can we all use first names? Is that possible? This is supposed to be a chat. I can imagine if we went to a Starbucks, we probably wouldn't call each other Dr. Covello or whatever. We'd probably be using first names. Does that sound okay, Jeff? Ben,
Absolutely,
everyone?
yeah.
So, first, when I said at coffee, I'll just share something personal. I was looking at the barista behind you, Ben. For years, my father used to get up after he retired, and we thought he was going fishing. He used to go fishing for what's called striped bass, surf fishing. And we found out later, actually, that when he woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, he actually didn't go fishing. He went out with his buddies to go to a diner to have breakfast. I think this was getting away from the women at the time. I'm not quite sure what happened, but nonetheless, he wasn't actually going fishing. So we're here in the chat. Let me just start off by saying what's unique about this whole COVID, what we've been doing, is something that Randy and I have observed. We've written documents in the past on Ebola, on Zika, on pandemic influenza. This is the first time where we have to keep revising the material that we have. I think we have now 60 questions posted on the State Health Director's website, where we have to revise the questions and the answers every 2 weeks. Quite literally, I've never seen a target that is such a moving target in the past, where the knowledge changes quickly, the policies change quickly, and of course this also puts a challenge in front of those of us involved in communication, that we have to stay up to date with the moving target that is changing every 2 weeks. So I was just going to stop there and say that's one of the unique about the whole COVID experience that I would do. Randy, do you want to say a few things? You have to unmute.
Unmute. I'm off mute now. Yeah, good idea. It speaks better when you're off. I think it transmits better when you're off mute. Yes, this is unprecedented. I mean, clearly, I mean, everybody says that, and of course, it is true. So we say it again. I think one of the things I'm witnessing with the COVID, if you just look, globally or even inside our own country, to some degree, this is a common enemy now, and we find that we have more in common in attempting to defeat this enemy than what separates us. And I think that's a kind of important moment in our time, and hopefully we can capitalize that and bring that through when this is over. My perspective comes from, I was at the World Health Organization when SARS erupted. And at that time, SARS was really scary. And remember, the SARS only ever got to about 8,000 cases globally. Well, 8,000 would be a number many countries would love to have in their case ledger. It was really frightening. It was growing like no one knew what it was. It was growing so fast. It seemed to be highly contagious. It caused huge damage to Southeast Asian economies, and it was COVID light and COVID warm up, really. So now with this one, with SARS, we call the virus COVID-2, but COVID is the disease. This is clearly, the real McCoy in terms of its infectivity and its ability to rapidly cross boundaries and cause tremendous suffering, disease, economic damage, and so on. And I think our response will have to continue to ramp up to meet that. I think a huge part of our response is communication. So this could not be a better moment to do that. And I think I'd like to start with those thoughts. This business of coming together and this business of communication becoming even more important as we face this public health crisis.
That's awesome. Thanks, Randy. Vincent, we just got a little feedback. Your mic was a little hard to hear and a little tinny. So I don't know if when you're up next, just if you could tweak your mic a little bit, that would be great. So Stephen, why don't you say hello and kind of your thoughts on COVID?
Well, thank you. And again, thank you for having me in this forum. I recently retired from LAPD about 2 weeks ago. And having spent 41 years in organizations, there's both that and the state, that are responsible for managing people's behavior. That's what law enforcement does. It manages people's behavior. to see now that all the rules have changed, the expectation has changed, and people throughout various populations are expected to act very different than what is natural to them, between the social distancing, between the stay at home, shelter in place. And remarkably, as what Randy has said, that the common enemy caused us to ramp up that change. Had we not had that, you can't even imagine how long getting social compliance would have taken. But the threat of this has been so universal, and at times has been resisted in terms of conversations, ideologies, etc. But at the end of the day, the data beats down the arguments. It's overwhelming. And because of that, what we've seen is extraordinary social change at so many levels, against so many odds. And to me, this is a great lessons that come out of this. And what we can look for the future is that the concept of crisis management has always been in the shadows. We'll only deal with it at the worst possible moment. Well, this is the worst possible moment. It's out in public. And we're going to hopefully see that these values that come out of it become part of our operating values for the future. And I find that the upside of all this terrible events. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you. And again, thank you to all of you for being here and just for sharing your perspectives. I can't think of three more dynamic and experienced personalities in health and pandemic to just be having coffee with. So this is fantastic. I got to toss it over to my colleague, Jeff Angel, who has got some questions for you guys. And we'll just pipe in as we go. And again, to all of you who have joined us, thank you again so much for being here. And do feel free to toss in the Q&A or just enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Ben. And it's great to see you, Vincent and Randy and Stephen. Thank you for joining us, and Doug for running the ticker on the chat. Our first question is from Dave. And Dave says, I understand a second wave of COVID-19 is anticipated. We'll probably throw this out to the group. From your experience, can you detail what a second wave might look like from a societal and psychological perspective, how companies should prepare for this, and what policies governments and health officials might want to look at implementing to address the issue? Heard lots about that in the news lately, the second and even third or fourth waves, but what might that look like from a communications response?
Randy, why don't you start on that one, because we have been addressing the question, when will the pandemic end? That's one of the 65 questions that you're addressing in the State Health Director's document.
Yeah. Well, the pandemic will, there'll be a definition that WHO will talk about when the pandemic ends. I mean, they declare it, but essentially when there's no new cases for a period of time. I think the business of the second wave is very topical. If you look at historically at respiratory pandemics with a similar contagious rate throughout human history, you do see these waves that come and go that are related to the availability of new susceptible hosts and things of that nature. And so also there's a seasonality component that we have yet to see because we haven't been through the season yet. However, there's evidence to suggest that it would probably follow seasonal patterns. So therefore, the waves would be consistent with the normal respiratory seasonal pattern in the northern and southern hemispheres. From a communication perspective, I think is really interesting. What we need from this is, there'll be three things to keep in mind about the second wave. One is that social distancing will be even more important. And not that we have to stay in lockdown for a second wave, but the importance of adhering to the concept and the spirit behind social distancing to reduce the infectivity between people to get the R0 or R naught, or the contagious index, down below 1 or at 1, or if you can. And it'll be hard to do initially, because social distancing is tiresome. It's a huge change in behavior. We humans don't really like it. It's against many of the ways we work, yet it will be necessary. And there are ways to augment it. There are ways to do it cleverly. There's ways to do it in a more sustainable fashion than a complete lockdown. Testing will become and tracing will be very much part of dealing with the second wave. Testing is like running through a forest. If you ran through a forest with your eyes closed, how long would it be till you just basically ran into a tree? Well, if you're not testing, that's what you're doing. You're running through a forest with your eyes closed. And so we have to get our eyes open. We have to test. We have to trace and do follow-up to chase up chains of transmission to try to stop the virus from transmitting to the next person. And finally, the third message in context of a second wave will be the importance of influenza vaccination. You might say to me, well, wait a minute, who cares about flu? Well, we all do, because influenza has a normal annual epidemic season as well. And we can immunize against flu. Vaccine's not perfect, but it's a lot better than nothing. And this reduces the burden on the healthcare system. If people are in the hospital because of flu, where they're taking beds or space or resources that can be used to deal with COVID, where we don't yet have a vaccine. So I think these are features of the so-called second wave or whatever that may come. I don't want to be predicting it. I mean, historically would be predicted, but this is we'll see what we see. I want to add one final comment, is that in 1918, many cities in the United States did implement social distancing rather promptly to deal with the influenza epidemic, and actually some of them relaxed it later. And what do you think happened when they relaxed social distancing? They got the wave. There's more in the wave. They got another mountain, really. So that's something to keep in mind. I mean, social distancing is one of the most effective tools. It just has to be used in a sustainable fashion. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of communication support for.
I'm really curious, Vincent, when we talk about the second or the potential second wave,
right,
and the messaging. So the messaging: stay home if you're feeling unwell, stay home, keep social distance, wash your hands, et cetera, et cetera. And the big push for flatten the curve, and that kind of started in Canada anyway, towards the end of winter before spring. Now we're kind of coming spring, summer. How do people process or respond to if we do get a second wave and those messaging and those asks reappear? So if we're coming back and saying to people again, we need you to go back and make sure you're doing this and doing that, are we more attentive, or do we kind of blow it off more because we did our part and now we're just trying to enjoy we're talking now about the returning to normal and reopening. If you get that second wave, does our messaging have to change to reflect that somehow?
Yeah. And is my audio any better now? Can you hear me any better than it did before?
It's fantastic.
Okay, good. It strikes me that the second wave is going to bring a whole host of new challenges, operational and communication challenges. And one in particular, I think, is you predicted it, and that is the psychological response, which could be, for example, denial and apathy. I've gone through this before. This raises the whole question, what's more important, the economy or life? People will start asking questions, are some lives more valuable than others? Can we continue, for example, to take the hits we're doing in our economy? I also believe that the second wave is going to raise much more to the surface many of the civil liberty issues that we're starting to face now, and I believe will come even more to the forefront in the second wave, such as social distancing, contact tracing. We're hearing now about Google and Apple having apps now that will trace your location, will be documenting who you're in contact with to make the lives of contact tracers easier. This is going to raise a whole host of civil liberty issues that I believe have almost no precedent in the last 50 years. I'll just stop there, but I know, Steve, would you like to say a few words about that? Stephen?
Yes. As Vincent said, it's going to raise issues that we have never dealt with before, or have dealt with in a much different venue. One of them is this extraordinary perceived invasion of privacy that's going to come forward. We're working right now on a project where we're looking at using some of our non-traditional approaches towards memory enhancement for tracing, contact tracing, so that because people are expected, when we're not talking about Google or Apple, people are expected to talk about where they've been for the last 15 days and to figure out where the possibilities in terms of either contact or transmission has occurred. With that, we realized just talking that people inherently don't want to tell some of the contacts that they've had, and they don't want them to be disclosed. So inevitably, these things are going to come to the surface. This is to be expected. And there's going to be areas that are just totally counterintuitive. We never would have seen them coming. But a lot of this is up to the leadership to practice through expected and unexpected scenarios and think about where it is going to lead us, and to prep ourselves in terms of how that communication is going to look in terms of these contexts.
Great.
Vincent, I've got a question for you that's come in from somebody that knows you. So I'll just read it. It says, "Dear Dr. Covello, my colleagues and I are very familiar with your neuroscience and psychological work on risk communication. Can you please answer the following question, which continues to baffle me and my friends?" I'm going to put myself in there as well. "Why are people hoarding toilet paper during the coronavirus pandemic?" Can you explain what that's about?
Okay. All right. So I'm going to put my professorial hat on, if that's okay with you. Do you mind if I make believe I'm in the classroom now? And so I'm going to preamble my response with one of my favorite reads is by Aristotle, not in the original Greek, but nonetheless. And he said, to address a problem, we have three ways by which we could communicate. Number one, we can use logic. For example, we can tell people it doesn't make any sense to hoard toilet paper. There's lots of toilet paper out there. Why would you ever want to hoard something that's in very liberal supply? Number two, if that doesn't work, you can use emotion. For example, get people upset that you're taking their toilet paper away from them. And the third is, he said, you can use authority, which means we ration toilet paper. He said, since obviously you're not behaving well, you're going to have to ration how many toilet paper rolls you're allowed to take from the market. So what Aristotle said 2,000 years ago, that for this type of problem, you're dealing with an emotional problem that's probably only going to be solved by authority. It's so deeply rooted in emotion that using logic will not be the solution. Using authority, such as regulations, rationing, would be the question. So now another hat on. As you were mentioning the question, there are about 20 things that went in my head. I'm going to select only 7 based on a principle stated in 1956 called the magic number 7, plus or minus 2 limits of the brain in low stress situations. Now we're in a coffee shop, which means I can only share with you 7 of the 20 because not only will it use up all the time, it'll also become overwhelming in terms of information. So what would they be? Let me give you the short version. Let me just see if I can make some quick notes on this. Okay, short version. These are just the keywords. Number 1, the answer to this is we have to go back to issues of scarcity. Number 2, conformity. Number 3, safety. Number 4, control. Number 5, trust. Number 6, worry budget. And number 7, the deepest of them all, primal fear. So I'm going to be very brief. Scarcity. When people think something that is valuable is scarce, they will tend to hoard it. If they see lots of people in the supermarket grabbing all the toilet paper, hey, look, this must be a scarce resource, therefore I will hoard it. Number two, conformity. We know from our crisis research that people often don't evacuate until they look up and down the street to see if other people are evacuating. Same thing here. If everybody else is grabbing the toilet paper, I'm going to grab it as well. Number three, safety, basic Maslow hierarchy, that we want to feel safe. And if this is the only way we can be safe, then I will hoard my toilet paper. At least it will keep me safe. It's not going to keep the enemy away, but nonetheless, at least I'll have my toilet paper. Number four, control. Our response to anxiety is often trying to control that which we can control. And if I can control what I think is a basic need, such as toilet paper, I will grab as much toilet paper as I can to address my anxiety. Trust. There's a lot of going on right now where we don't trust what people are telling us. Even the basic things such as there's enough toilet paper out there, let alone trust the government or trust industry to do the right thing. Worry budget. There's only so much we can worry about in life. Quite literally, our brains get overwhelmed with too much information, and we have a budget. Don't ask me to worry about too much because then I will become dysfunctional. So therefore, this is one less thing that I have to worry about. And finally, number seven, primal fear. Toilet paper goes back Freudian-like to very basic fears, goes back to fears of disease, cleanliness, disease, all the associations that come to mind when we think about it. And so therefore, having toilet paper gives us a sense of comfort in terms of our very, very basic Jungian basic needs. So there we go. There's a 3-minute answer to a very, very complex question.
Thank you, Vincent. That is without a doubt the most thorough discussion I've had on the topic of toilet paper in my life. So definitely appreciate this. Stephen, I've got a question for you. With all your law enforcement experience and handling of terrorism and the major crimes unit there, what can the experience of crisis decision making offer leaders during these times, specifically these times? Are you able to link what is best practices before to what's going on right now?
Yes, I think I can offer some ideas that I've seen over decades and decades of being on the ground, looking at crisis, looking at decision making, and looking at the consequences. What is very important to start off is to understand that crisis by themselves is fundamentally different than our day-to-day experience. So the decisions to make us competent in this realm day-to-day or our communications don't necessarily translate to make us competent during crisis. A crisis is fast-moving. The problem morphs. Oftentimes we're under-resourced to solve the problem. And failure has catastrophic possibilities. So with that, I'm going to take Vincent's lead and give you about 3 different ideas to look at. One is having organizational processes, organizing processes. Our governments, the US, Canada, works off of the incident command system, where what we take is a variety of government agencies, and under new rules during a crisis, we form them as an incident command system where we take them out of their silos. They're forced to do a whole government approach to the problem. This allows them to get past their traditional barriers that stop government from being efficient during this. However, it's not global. These processes are not global, universal, not done always the same way. So, but they are a process. Private sector has a little bit more challenging. They are having disrupted supply chains. They're posed at greater financial risk. They have distributed workforces. And so they don't have a go-to incident command system. This is a challenge for leaders. They need to create within their various organizations how they're going to do business during this, and how they're going to marshal the resources to the various affected problems. The next is decision-making processes themselves. We need to understand that you have to have a way to establish the confidence of the data that's coming in, because you're going to have confirmed data, unconfirmed data, unknown data. You've got to figure out the way of how you're going to manage that process, because at the end of the day, it maps out your problem. The leaders need to also understand that problems morph, and they can morph very fast. And so you have to be able to ensure that you're working the problem you need to be working. It's too easy to work the wrong problem perfectly. And we've seen the disasters that come out of that. And looking at, just by example, Mumbai, a terrorist event. The terrorists arrive, the LEP terrorists arrive in Mumbai. They go into an active shooter mode. They start shooting various venues. The resources come to try to stop the active shooter. The terrorists then go to Taj Mahal Hotel. They barricade in place. They burn the hotel. We've changed from active shooter mode to a hostage rescue mode. Fukushima starts it off in an earthquake, transition to a massive tidal wave, to a nuclear accident. All those, the problem changes, and the leaders need to recognize their skill sets, the resources change in place. And this is where the playbooks come. Organizations and governments need to have operational playbooks as a typology of problems, the different kinds of problems that they're going to be dealing with, rehearse it, train to them, understand them. Don't do a one and done and shelve it. And this is the thing I mentioned about crisis management during this event particularly, has come out of the shadows and is now challenging the operational values at the organizational level and governmental level, how we're going to do business in the future. These are the things I think that the three takeaways: organizational processes, decision-making processes, and having the playbooks.
Stephen, if I could just add a quick addendum on, I was actually in Mumbai when that happened. I'm not sure if we ever talked about that. And
no, I was there as well. God, I'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, wow, look at that. I was at the Taj Hotel, actually, right? And so we're going to chat about this later. This is great. But I wanted to just add that one of the things I found fascinating was that the terrorists were watching TV, and they were using, I mean, this is somewhat pre-social media, but quite literally, they were tracking what the authorities were doing, but just by turning on their TV, which of course made the whole response much more complex than it otherwise would be. I'll just share that simple note. Absolutely.
Offline, we'll have a lot to talk about.
Oh, I want to be in on that coffee too, because
no kidding. Well, that's
So I just want to toss back to Stephen, just in the spirit of chat. I've kind of been thinking of like this idea of new normal, and you know, lots of speculation about, are people still gonna keep distance from each other when the pandemic is over? Is the cruise line, are people going to go on a cruise again just because of the information, the conversation we heard around cruise lines? And Doug and I were talking about the shift to the new norm, and we kind of equated it to like the Titanic, in that it's such a huge monster, and it'd just be this gradual kind of shift, or this gradual change of course that maybe we don't even realize, and it just becomes what we are accustomed to. And I kind of think about 9/11 and all of the changes to security at the airports, and how all of a sudden it was this big change, but now we don't even bat our eyes, because it's you know, when you talk about risk communication is looking for typically a change or a behavioral response from an audience. And so now when you go to the airport, we're not surprised when they ask us to take off our shoes. I'm actually surprised when they say, don't worry about your shoes now. And so this whole shift, like, do we expect to see this behavior that is so subtle that it just is, because it's moving, changing course, like this Titanic kind of thing? I'm still trying to wrap my head around that.
I can start on that. I mean, I think that, you know, so yes, this pandemic is going to change our behavior without question for a long period of time. But it'll be more like a dimmer switch in terms of, it won't be, I don't think it'll be a switch on, switch off. Okay, the switch on was fairly fast because it had to be. But as we move away from, sort of lockdown, if you will, yeah, I think it will be a gradual process. I think many of the features that we're experiencing now will stay with us for a long time. I think washing people's hands, people washing hands is going to be a big part of our future. And actually, that's a good thing. There's plenty of influenza that's transmitted and other respiratory viruses from hands. So sort of like your picture with the airport security, it's considerably different today than it was, 1 month after 9/11, right, or 2 months after 9/11. It's a lot different. It's more targeted. It's been relaxed in certain areas to target the effective security where there's the highest risk. And that's, I think, what we'll see also with with our life in post-pandemia. Believe it or not, COVID-19 one day will be in the rearview mirror. Hard to believe right now, particularly, but one day that's where it'll be, and we'll be talking about it. But there will be things about it that will stay with us. I'd like to think that there will be this renewed importance and this spotlight of public health as a security measure, amongst other things, will stay with us, and that we will see a bolstering of the public health systems to support that, recognizing that when we defund or neglect it or ignore it, it has a cost. Cost may not be measured today, but it's definitely measured. And I'm hoping that is one of the positive outcomes. And then also this concept of us coming together, recognizing that we have common problems and that we're going to be more effective in managing those problems working together than we will as working against each other is a big part of this. I firmly believe that the solution for COVID-19 absolutely demands that we work together. And we're going to find that out either the hard way or the easy way. And I'm hoping that it will be the easy way, or at least the medium easy way, and that there will be an enduring legacy from that in terms of how we approach other common problems, which there are no shortage of.
I'll just add that I hope, though, in 5 years, we're not all still wearing masks. If that becomes part of the new normal, but I do think that maybe we'll stop handshaking. We might do, as in Stephen mentioned, India, where we greet people, for example, with a namaste as opposed to a handshake as a way by which to adapt to the social distancing. So great.
Yes, think about that. Oh, I'm sorry. This. What was the disease? There was disease in the Middle Ages was transmitted by contact. So wearing gloves became popular as a mean of reducing disease transmission. Now it's not so popular anymore, but it's sort of things like that. I think that'll be some of the pieces of our behavior that we carry with us. And I want to take a moment just for a second, if you don't mind, to bridge back to something that Stephen was talking about. Is if policing is an attempt to change behavior or manage public's behavior, because ultimately, and I think Stephen would agree with this, that policing is getting the public to cooperate with the law, right? It's ultimately our system of government, and law enforcement is based on public cooperation. I mean, it is. I mean, speed limits. Okay, speed limits may not be the best thing to talk about, but stop signs or something like that. I mean, we stop because we do, right? There's not like there's a police officer standing at every stop sign with a ticket book. Public health is also very similar. I mean, the response to COVID, a successful response to COVID, is really the public's cooperation. I mean, that's the most important fact in dealing with this pandemic, especially right now. And this has huge communication implications. We need to communicate well. And we need to engage and keep the public's interest, support cooperation in order to most efficiently fight this pandemic. And some of that's been done with degrees of success in other countries. There's things we can learn there. And if you look at those models and things they've done, a lot of that has been public cooperation and effective communication.
Great.
Stephen, did you want to add something there?
Yeah. I really, as both Vincent and Randy have said, there's going to be a new social norming that's going to come out of this. I believe. I think that this has been a very interesting test case as to how to change behaviors in terms of various societies. and then with the expectation that they're going to moderate that behavior and possibly return to that behavior depending on the threat. You see this during war, you see this, in England during the bombing sessions, World War II. But you also realize that many organizations have a raison d'etre, why they're in a business. And I think that's going to change, whether it be the government, it's not going to be, this is my lane, not your lane. And even in the private sector, to understand that they have to be thinking not only in terms of the bottom line, but in terms of their employee base. What are they good? What are these people? How are we going to be able to take care of these people? So I think that is a lot of changes that are in place. And yes, one of the things you look at after decades and decades of being in organizations that do manage behavior is the greatest amount of management is self-management. It's not imposed by government. It's not imposed through order. It's self-management. And how do you create that message? How that it continues? In there's the phrase in philosophy, laws are created when social relationships break down. And that is, we need to look at how can we get better in terms of the social relationships. There's a lot of cross-disciplinary discussions that are going on right now to look at what the next phase of us means.
Stephen, let me ask you this question. Should we have laws about how much toilet paper a person can have in their home?
I as you were talking about that, I thought to myself, those are the kind of questions that probably should be more appropriate for graduate level philosophy.
I'm thinking if people are highly stressed and highly concerned about toilet paper, they should have 3 roles.
Nice.
Because in high stress, high concern situations,
yes,
it's the
rule of
Covello
3.
number 3. Yeah.
I like that.
I would just like to point out, for the person who has the mirror on in the background, I was watching you order toilet paper on Amazon while we were talking. You know who you are.
Okay, we've got, I'm going to throw this one to you, Randy, and Vincent chime in here, and you too, Stephen. How do you effectively communicate health information that is constantly evolving, especially when authorities, in essence, might be providing contradictory information at the beginning, and then as it evolves, it changes? Randy, I know maybe they trained you well at Annapolis, and then your significant time in the Navy, you probably were trained to handle things changing constantly. But from a communication standpoint, that's gotta be a big challenge.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think I'll pick up from what we learned during SARS at WHO. I remember SARS. This has helped us answer this question. I remember vividly. I came back from, I think was on a ski holiday or something like that. And I walked into work on Monday morning early, and there was my boss, David Heyman, with Reuters camera rolling in our office. Live global television. And it was all about SARS. And it was like, wow, the world has changed. And what that taught me was a few things. Number one is this importance of uncertainty. And so in terms of communicating, one thing there'd be 3 things. One thing is the importance of is acknowledging uncertainty, that we don't have the answers. I think that, that we can talk about how hard we are looking to find them and what we're doing about that. But it's very important to acknowledge that the limits of our knowledge, and this is often not done or worse, and has a lot of implications for losing credibility, for people, going to other sources for information that may be a whole lot less credible. It is important to acknowledge what we do know. I think it's important to tell people what we do know. I remember this during SARS. We were sitting there behind, very secure communications and computers and stuff, where we had information that we knew that was not public yet, that we thought was credible enough to release. We certainly never went as far as to say more than we knew, but we were also very much willing to tell people what we did know. And that was important because the public does appreciate that, the openness, the sharing. It allows them to make the, it's one of the basic tenets of risk communication is the sharing of the risk. So sharing information is hugely important. And then last, I think it's actually important to recognize that there's a small degree of optimism here goes a long ways, that this is not 1918. It isn't. This is 2020. Okay. Now, admittedly, many of the tools we have today at the moment to fight COVID aren't a whole lot different than 1918, what they had in 1918. But we do have a lot more things. I mean, if you think about the development of the testing, development of the new medicines, the speed which this virus has identified, sequenced, the widespread development of reasonably, sufficiently accurate tests, shall I say, the sharing of knowledge is going on amongst academics and physicians around the world is unprecedented. That's just unprecedented. So there's some things happening that are just really amazing. And I firmly believe that these are the things, coupled with the public engagement, they're going to get us through this storm.
So a couple things there. And I know Dr. Vincent and Randall, you've been working on this document for all of the heads of states, for all of the state health authorities. And this is, and just for everybody here, Doug, if you can post that link, it's a document designed to support all of the heads of states health officials with how they can answer questions. And there's like 60 answers to 60 different questions. And that's a very valuable resource. And you had said that this is one of the first times you're having to constantly update it because the science is changing so fast. We had a question in one of our webinars about credibility as it relates to science messaging. And so an example is earlier on in this pandemic, health officials said, don't wear a mask. It's not going to help. And now further into the crisis, into the pandemic, they're saying, well, you might want to wear a mask if you're going out. And my answer to that, and I just check this with you guys, is that I think there's a difference when scientists will come and say, this won't, like very matter of fact, as opposed to the current research tells us, or based on current research, we believe that. And so if you frame it differently, it then allows you to say, we care about you so much. We've done more and more research into the efficacy of wearing masks, and we now have new science. But when you make an absolute statement right up at the front that says masks don't help, then when that science or that information changes, you've got to, but if you just frame it differently, am I on with that?
Yeah, you are. Actually, I have a lifelong campaign to eliminate absolutes from the language we use in public health or crisis situations. I would argue that absolutes, words such as never, nothing, every part of our organization is working on this. There's no risk to emergency responders. Just take COVID. The risk is low. That was one of the messages actually that was stated in the very beginning. Great Britain, United States, Canada, the risk is low. That was an absolute statement, as opposed to based on our current knowledge, it appears that the risk is low, as opposed to putting an absolute in front of people. So I'm going to ask, I know Randy and I have continually deal with this when we're writing the answers because the scientists want to offer up the absolutes. Nothing like this has ever happened before.
Right.
All of our efforts are focused on, et cetera. And we keep pulling back and saying, we can't use absolutes when we talk about a crisis. Randy.
Absolutely, Vincent.
Absolutely. Now, I would add, if you're a politician, you could do it. You can use absolutes as a politician, but not as a communicator.
Yeah, let me expand on that. So we rarely use absolutes. This is one time I would use it. It's absolutely a bad idea to use absolutes in the middle of a crisis, anytime really, because to think you know it all is just you will almost surely be proven wrong. And then we think about that a lot in like this business with face coverings and face masks. I mean, there were this is a classic example. And there were statements that were talking about one end of the spectrum and then to the other end of the spectrum, and now we're back in the middle somewhere, and who knows where to land. It's just that when you use those, like Vincent said, when you use these apps, you lose credibility because, they said this, they said that. Well, who do I believe? Well, then you don't. So you go off somewhere else that tells you a different story. Maybe they have more of an agenda. And this is one of the things that is concerning, that it'll lose. In a crisis, it's really difficult to be right all the time anyway. I mean, things are changing so fast.
And the biggest danger, I'm just going to share this in terms of what Randy said. The biggest danger I see here is that if, in fact, you believe you can't trust the source of information, social media has also changed the playing field. It's called confirmation bias. I will look for information that supports what I already believe or what I would like to believe. And I will tend to discount all the information that's contrary to what I believe or what I would not want to believe. That landscape has so radically changed when you deal with inconsistent information that it has huge communication consequences. Stephen.
Just a couple of things. One is we're looking for certainty during crisis. This is just a natural human response. And it's a structural problem because your information streams for data are filled again with a variety of confidence level of what you can say about that data. There's the other thing is the scientific literacy of our leaders. That's the full spectrum. And so that sometimes makes the communication inherently difficult because you have scientists that are offering one set of commentaries in terms of the problem, and then you have leadership that are taking the scientific input as one of many things that they're looking at and discounting it relative to whatever their background is. And the thing that I know Vincent and I have talked about for many, many years is the advent of the 24/7 news cycle. The pressure on that to come up with something and to say, to something new and to follow up on that. And the human brain's only capable of so much. And especially during crisis, that cognitive load gets very high, very quick. And people start saying things that right off the cuff that probably should have been practiced.
I want to add on to this, if you don't mind. Just, I think this communication. I mean, this is about communication, and all of us here, I think, would support how important it is. And also, I'm looking ahead. I'm looking at the communication we're already starting to see about a potential vaccine against COVID-19. I mean, let's be honest, the vaccine hasn't been discovered yet, right? And it also may never be discovered. We're hopeful. There's a lot of effort and a lot of great ideas, and I'm certainly hopeful we will see one because it will certainly be one of the most efficient ways to herd immunity and relieve a great deal of suffering. But we're already seeing. I was walking in my neighborhood, and my neighbor, who's a ER doc at the VA, Veterans Administration, said to me, Randy, they're already telling me they don't want the COVID vaccine. And I said, well, what COVID vaccine? And they said, well, they said there's too much mercury in it. And I'm like, wow, that's what we are. So,
Randy, I'm dying to know, and I can't help myself. If I was there with you and I rubbed my hand along your wall, is that textured wallpaper or is that?
It does have a texture, yes.
Oh, I imagined it to be so. Like fuzzy, right? Like a fuzzy.
Yeah, well, a slight, it has like a slightly ruffled feel. It's not quite fuzzy.
Yeah. Well, I got warm and fuzzies.
There you go. But this communication in the vaccine front, and we'll see that in just this business with these medicines, about hydrochloroquine or whatever being so great, and of course not being shown up, and then other things that have been proposed. All this does is like Vincent said, drives down the credibility from the news source, causes people to question, and then they go to social media sites who are going to tell them what they want to hear. And this is a really bad spark, or boiling chip in the water. I think this is something that the risk communication folks and crisis communication folks are going to find a double dose of of challenge when this comes along. And, you know, the other thing we also, just on that kind of note, is that although vaccines will be very important, it's not the only solution to this. You know, the tracing, the testing, any preventive therapies that are developed. So the idea is that maybe if we test people, we can give them some kind of medicine or drug that just reduces the likelihood of them getting infected, their contacts getting infected. So there's really powerful opportunities that are even short of a vaccine that sort of, you know, also aren't being talked about. So we have to think about how this is all being put out. I mean, yes, a vaccine is part of the solution. It's not the only part of the solution. And we have to be careful how we talk about it, because we're already getting this sort of noise and chatter, and we don't even have one yet. So anyway.
And just to build on that, Randy and Vincent and Stephen, it is a serious issue when trusted sources, the credibility begins to erode, either because they've used absolutes or gotten ahead of themselves. Like that's a real, not just a communication challenge, that's a societal challenge. If the trusted sources that we go to start to lose credibility, that's got to hamper our ability to model good behavior, whether from a law enforcement standpoint. And I'll just add, I'm interested in your points of view on this. The other thing I believe is that the social isolating has driven us all literally back into our caves, and now we're all online. And now to what Vincent was talking about, that confirmation bias, we're all hanging out where we really want to believe things that align with our beliefs to be true. And I'm just finding, as we re-engage in person, that's a huge issue. I have very close and reasonable friends that have said the most outrageous thing. Oh, I've heard this online, or I've heard that. I'm like, where did you get that? And so I'm a big fan of going to trusted resources, but also, to your point, it's critically important to keep them credible.
Yeah. I'll just say a couple of things, Jeff, about this. I think one of the most important discoveries in the risk communication literature in the last 20 years was the discovery of the complexity of trust. How do we make decisions about trust in low stress situations and high stress? And the discovery was that the usual suspects are still there: competence, honesty, transparency. But the one that came out of the research was the importance of compassion, caring, empathy, and listening. And driving as much of half of all the determination of trust. And that's one that has been quite missing in a lot of the communications that we're seeing, is that we're hearing people talk about how competent we are, how much testing we're doing, so many tests, just rattling off numbers, without the most important message of all of, I could only imagine how difficult it is for people staying at home for 2 months. Something as basic as that is missing from the vocabulary that we were using. Stephen, I know you're seeing this too. Is that right?
Well, one of the things in terms, especially during crisis, is leaders have a tendency to form strong assumptions. They, in order to move with any sense of certainty, they want strong assumptions so they can get to strong conclusions. Now, as one goes further along in terms of a crisis, people become pretty much calcified in terms of those assumptions. It's harder and harder to change people the more that they've deployed themselves downrange in the belief system. And you see this in command posts, you see this in large-scale operations. If you come in at the beginning, you can set up a lot of things. If you come in the middle, it's a little harder. If you come at the end, it's almost impossible, even if you have the right answer. And so that's part of just human behavior during this, is that we're tending towards certainty. We want to make sure that this bush doesn't have a lion in it, so we're going to avoid all bushes. And so, so this is always in play that we have to deal with. And then we also, as Vincent says, you have these alternate sources of reality, the internet, where people find, because people want to believe that they're believing right. So they find the people that are willing to give the data to things that they really want to believe, not necessarily even what they believe, but that they want to believe. And then that becomes the new, belief system for that. So, yeah.
Randy, the care and empathy part, what's we haven't discussed that recently. We've been focused on the technical side of things in the document. Have you noticed what I've noticed?
Absolutely, Vincent. It's something I think about. If I was to offer opportunities to improve the document, I think even a stronger statement about the importance of that might be useful, because people are really being challenged right now. This is hard. It's hard for everybody, and you need trust, right? And we know from the research you talked about, Vincent, this trust is this business of openness, honesty, caring, empathy, how important it is. And that carries through not just in our, our televised or Zoom communications, but also in our written communications. And it's amazing how few words it takes to convey that. So, or how easy an expression can be. I remember I was some years ago, I was talking to one of our state health officials who lives in one of the United States that has a large chemical plants in it. And they smell, right? They have an odor. And of course, the people who live nearby don't like the odor and are concerned about health effects and things of that nature naturally. And many people would show up and say, "Oh, I can't believe how hard it is to live here. Feel so sorry for you," and all this kind of stuff. And the people just got tired of hearing that. They just thought it was false, it was misleading, and they thought they felt patronized. So this one state health official said to me, she said, "I don't believe in empathy. I said, so when they asked you this question, what did you say to them?" And she says, "I don't know how you can live here with that smell." It's like, that's a nice statement of empathy, So I think that's a sort of a kind of an example to help us remind ourselves that caring and empathy can be expressed, easily, and in ways that don't necessarily require this sort of formal statement, if you will. And it's very important because it builds that rapport with your audience, that trust factor that we know are so important in the literature.
Right.
Can I just add one small aside that comes out of law enforcement? Some years ago, our traffic stops were done, and it was all about protecting the officer, in terms of officer survival. And then I saw something really an interesting change was the California Highway Patrol, which does nothing but traffic stops. And I listened to how they actually had scripted their traffic stop by introducing themselves to the person before they even begin to tell them why they were stopped. And it fundamentally, from their position, changed what that interaction was. But what I found interesting is they had to train to it. It was not natural for them. And even the statements for the people in government about empathy is sometimes a little practice on that statement might help, because of the fact for many of us, it doesn't come as natural as it should.
I believe that the point also I just would emphasize and underline boldface is that these are learned skills. Sometimes people, they picked it up along life, but you also can teach a person the importance of empathy. I was on the phone with a provider, had to do with my internet service, and it was interesting when I called up and said I'm getting very variable internet service. Instead of pointing out that I didn't have the right program app running, she said, I could only imagine how frustrating this must be for you. That's how she started the conversation. And I have a feeling that's probably in her manual. Somewhere in her manual, it says, don't just tell the person they're stupid, that they're not pressing the right button. Try to put yourself in their shoes and feel the frustration. Then tell them that they're stupid in the process.
People want to know that you care before they care what you know.
That's a brilliant statement, man.
I know. I use it all the time. I just want to time check with you guys. I I just tweeted, like I am like a crisis risk communication sponge when I'm around you guys, and I could soak this up for hours. I just want to time check because I know you have a lot of obligations. Are you cool to hang out for a couple more minutes, or do you?
Sure.
I know you're in New York and LA and Pennsylvania, and it's a long way to get home from this coffee shop.
That's great.
But if you got a few more minutes, that would be great. And I also just want to acknowledge and thank, everybody who put in a question. And we didn't know how this would go and what the response would be, and so it's overwhelming. And deepest thanks for everybody that engaged and posed a question. And I mean, I could sit here for 12 days. I have so many questions. So I just want to acknowledge and thank everybody who sent in a question, and encourage you to join us next week for Crisis and Coffee. Actually, next week, we're Bob Brighton from Washington, D.C., longtime airline guy, director of communications, corporate comms. He's going to be joining us. And it'll be a lot less, not that this is formal, but it'll be back to meeting style next week. And you can find the link for that on our website. I encourage you just to come in and drop in. I know this one was a little different, but selfishly, I just want to soak these people up a little more. So, yeah.
I love it. Yeah.
Now, okay, so people want to know that you care before you care what you know. That was Theodore Roosevelt. But have you done research that continues to support that? Because it's so powerful.
Yeah. There's a number of ways you can do research on this. One is simply asking. In fact, so seldom do we do what's called evaluation research in risk communication. Randy and I have been talking about this, is that one of the reasons we often don't evaluate, such as trust. How do you start off? Where are you when you start the communication effort in terms of trust? And where do you finish up in terms of trust when you complete your communication? I could count probably on my two hands how many research projects actually begin with that a premise that we want to see if we're effective. How did we start on trust? How did we finish on trust? And then you would break down trust into the dimensions. For example, how competent do they feel you are before you start the communication? How competent are you after the communication? How much honesty, what ratings do they give you on honesty, openness, transparency before, honesty, transparency, openness after? The classic way we do medical research, before, after. Does the intervention make a difference? The reason we often don't do that type of evaluation is that sometimes we simply want to do what's called process evaluation. Just finding out, for example, how many people tuned in, how many brochures we handed out, etc., as opposed to making real psychological change in the audience itself. With a few studies where that has been done, the answer is a definitive yes. Is that when the communicators display caring empathy as a prime aspect of the communication, the levels of trust go up exponentially from beginning to end. We saw that, for example, very carefully in the H1N1 pandemic, where Dr. Besser, who was the acting head of CDC, took command of the ship. We knew where CDC was at the beginning, and we also knew where CDC was at the end. And sometimes a pandemic actually gives you that scope, beginning and end, and see where we stand. And it was very clear that what people were rating him on were his caring empathy, as opposed to competence, expertise, transparency, or even dedication and experience. Randy, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, these sort of these throughput measures or these effect measures, I think, are huge. I think this is one of the hardest things to measure, and where it's been measurable or paid close attention to, there's been tremendous. It's been certainly associated with tremendous benefit. I think of the document that we've written for ASTA that we continue to write for the state health directors. It is blatantly their most popular download ever. With thousands of hits. I mean, every week, every day. I don't know. It's just it's a huge volume. So is that an indicator of success, or is that an indicator of effect? And that's a question, that I would like to answer. We nowadays, people do look at clicks and measure and hits and all that kind of stuff. And I guess it's an indication that something's popular, it therefore must be good. Otherwise, why would these people be doing it? That's one thing. But how do you go to the next step where showing that the effect of tight, good communication has had on promoting solid public health practices and reducing the burden of this disease or this epidemic? That's the kind of information I would really like to see.
So let me ask Stephen. Stephen, you were talking about that change in the behavior of the officers. Did you do an evaluation? I mean, how would you evaluate that change in behavior that you were talking about, when they did the stops, before, after, and how do we know that program was successful?
Well, I don't know if they actually did any assessment on this. Obviously, in something like that, one would have to look at one of the indicators or metrics is complaints against the officers.
Right.
Yeah, and so with that tells you right off the bat, because there is a certain percentage of complaints that pretty much happen day in and day out against the officers, especially during the experience of getting traffic tickets. So that might be one metric that you could look at. And as you were talking, I was thinking back over the decades, and I remember I was assigned to South Central right after the LA riots. And my job was to figure out a way to reestablish relationships with the community. And we spent a lot of time having long-term discussions with the officers to try to develop compassion and conversation to those that would be willing to listen to us. And during my stay there, fundamental shift in terms of the receptivity towards the Los Angeles Police Department was we saw in larger and larger populations. On another note, while you were talking, I was thinking about two areas where the identification with the person is so critical. One is hostage negotiation, and the other is adversarial interviews. In hostage negotiation, the continuous theme is keep rapport, because without that, there's no sense of collective problem solving. And a huge change in terms of interrogations has been the structural training towards rapport development with the officer and the suspect in order to get better results. And we're actually, in Los Angeles Police Department, is doing assessments on that right now.
So let me throw this back to Ben and Jeff. So in your work with your clients, what type of evaluation do you do or would you recommend in order to determine that something is successful? How do we hold up our hands and say, job well done? What's your perspective? I'm going to throw that back into your court.
So it's probably, I'll take a stab at that first, Vincent, and then throw it over to Ben. Just like everyone has been talking about, having as defined metrics as we possibly can. From my experience, internal communications with an organization to employees inside is probably a lot easier to measure, but the golden rule is don't ask, you want to start with a baseline, but don't ask people what they think about communications or anything within an organization unless you're prepared to do something or act on it. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but having that metric, and I know we do a lot of work with the IABC, the International Association of Business Communicators. They have standards and metrics that you need to demonstrate behavioral change in your communications efforts. And that can be, like Stephen was talking about, maybe that's increased sales, increased market share. My time at British Airways, that's the one thing that we were always looking at was our market share in each market that we flew to. So having solid metrics is key. Otherwise, you're right. You're talking about how many times something was clicked on or impressions you had rather than having that solid defined metric.
Mm-hmm. Ben, you.
I think Jeff covers it. I think we're well beyond looking for the click through or how many How many engagements did you get on your post? Especially when it comes to pandemic and crisis, I'm more interested in what the behavior is. Have we been able to affect the behavior that we want to see from our stakeholders? So did people evacuate? Have people kept that social distance?
Yeah.
And that, I think, you're got to look at overarching, the curve, the flatten the curve, the number of cases, and all of those bits. So it's a lot deeper than, did you click on that link? Because the click on the link is so easy, but it doesn't show you the end result, right? The ultimate goal.
I like that because it brings us back full circle to something that Randy was talking about, which is the importance of public involvement, public engagement in an activity such as social distancing. Are people social distancing themselves, regardless of whether or not there's a law out there that says you have to do so? So that's good. That's good.
I do have one last question here. Vincent, I'll start with you. It's from Kelly. So it's a big picture question. And the question is, what changes would you make in your messaging or maybe your approach as we progress through a continued crisis such as this? And how do we manage communication with stakeholders that are at different levels of risk tolerance and anxiety? When we've got a pretty disparate group that we're communicating to in terms of risk tolerance.
Right.
She'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Once again, I'm going to put my professorial hat on. Risk tolerance. What makes a person risk tolerant, or sometimes we use the expression acceptable risk. We know it varies greatly from person to person. Another discovery that's critical to answer that question is we know now that the facts play a very small role in determining risk tolerance or risk acceptability. There are 20 different factors that play a role. The most important is one we've discussed today, which is trust. My tolerance for risk largely depends on who's managing the risk, or my ability to affect my destiny. Do I trust myself? So it's sometimes referred to as self-efficacy. Can I do something about the risk myself? Or do I trust those that are managing the risk? And this goes back, of course, to all the fears about things such as nuclear power, et cetera. We still have 19 other variables, such as fairness. People have different perceptions of what's fair or unfair. Different perceptions of what's voluntary or involuntary. Different perceptions about, for example, issues such as control, how much control. And I would argue that if we, in fact, understand how people perceive those different factors, it gives us the levers by which to change those behaviors. I'll throw that back to Randy. Randy, I know that.
I mean, I'm a huge believer in trust. Trust, because fear is such a primary emotion, and when the chips are down and we're backed into a corner, or we're dealing with something we really don't understand, haven't seen before, COVID-19, fear is dominant, and trust is a powerful tool to deal with fear. So I believe factors that increase trust are really the ones that will help us keep the message getting across. And those are honesty, openness, caring, compassion. And then down the line are credentials, position, and things of that nature. But those other things, those emotional connections are so important. And we'll have to, and people who double down on that will see the results, in my opinion.
That's so fantastic. I want to thank Vincent and Randy and Stephen and Jeff and Doug, and for everybody who joined us virtually today for a fly-on-the-wall coffee chat with arguably some of the world-leading experts in pandemic and health and risk communications. We wish we could get to all of the questions. Very appreciative for, I was going to use but in there, and I'll never forget, Vincent, when you're like, if you use the word but, you negate everything that you just said. And so I've been working very hard on the last.
It also negates what you say afterward too. So.
Yeah, I'll try not to use but. And very appreciative for all the questions, and appreciative for everybody who joined us. I will ask the panelists to stick around, so I have a virtual gift for you, so don't hang up yet. but no, I didn't. I just said, but thank you for everybody who tuned in. I wish we could continue this for another 2 hours, but
That's
we
been a
can't.
great pleasure, but we can't.
And we can't.
And we
we
can't.
And we cannot. I also invite you to join us Thursdays, 3:00 Eastern, Crisis and Coffee. As I said, it's a different format typically. So check it out. Join us. No pressures. Just come in and have a chat. So thank you very much, everybody who popped in and for sharing your time with us.